I remember the day everything changed, not because there was anything remarkable about it, but because of how painfully ordinary it was. It's strange how the most devastating moments of our lives rarely come announced. They slip into the world quietly, disguised as any other hour, any other minute. One moment I was living the life I thought I understood, and the next, it felt like the entire structure holding me together collapsed inward. Losing a child isn't something you prepare for. It isn't a storm you see brewing in the distance. It's a sudden silence, a sharp absence, a hollow space where laughter used to echo. And once it happens, once that silence settles into the corners of your home, it never fully leaves. People tell you that time heals. They say grief softens. But the truth is, grief doesn't vanish. It evolves. It becomes part of your breathing, part of your walking, part of the way you look at the world. Every morning I woke up to a house that felt too big, too quiet, too alive with memories I didn't ask to relive. Her room, untouched. Her toys, untouched. Her little shoes by the door, untouched, as if I was afraid that moving anything would shatter the thin thread that still connected me to her. I'd catch myself listening for her footsteps. I'd look at the clock and think, this is when she'd be home from school. I'd stop myself from calling her name down the hallway, because for a split second, my mind would forget reality, and then it would all hit again, sharp and merciless. And it's funny how grief changes the way you look at other people. You start noticing how easily they laugh, how effortlessly they move through their days, unaware of how fragile that comfort is. You envy them, not because you want what they have, but because you remember having it once and knowing you can never get it back. Nights were the worst. The mind finds ways to torture itself when the world gets still. Every creak in the house used to send a jolt through my chest. I knew she wasn't there. Logic told me she wasn't there. But grief doesn't care about logic. It creates echoes, tricks, and whispers in the dark, reminders of what your heart refuses to let go. I'd lie awake imagining her voice, imagining her tugging at my sleeve, like she used to, when she wanted me to look at something she drew. Sometimes I'd hear soft laughter in the back of my mind, and I'd close my eyes tightly, forcing the memory away before it could swallow me completely. I'd try to keep myself busy during the day, work, chores, anything to keep my mind from drifting toward the places it always wanted to go. But the moment I sat down, the moment I breathed too deeply, it all came rushing back. It was like drowning in waves you knew were coming, but couldn't prepare for. Grief makes you forget who you were before it arrived. I used to be someone who found comfort in noise, in people, in conversation. After she was gone, silence was the only thing that made sense. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to explain anything to anyone. Their sympathy felt like a spotlight I didn't want, and their attempts to cheer me up felt like trying to patch a sinking ship with pieces of paper. You learn to live in shadows after a loss like that, not because you want to, but because the light feels too harsh, too revealing, too many colors when all you feel inside is gray. And every now and then something small, something insignificant, would break me in ways no one else could see. A child's laughter in a grocery store, a cartoon she used to watch playing on someone's phone, a little pink backpack hanging in a store window. It's incredible how ordinary objects can become weapons when grief sharpens them. And I tried to heal. I really did. I tried therapy. I tried talking to friends. I even tried pretending everything was fine. But every attempt felt like I was forcing myself into a shape that no longer fit. I had lost something no parent should ever lose. I had lost a future, hers and mine. But the worst part wasn't the memory of losing her. The worst part was how deeply I clung to the moments before I lost her. Her smile when she came running into the kitchen, the way she held my hand with her tiny fingers, the way she'd look over her shoulder while walking ahead just to make sure I was still behind her. It's those little things that carve permanent wounds. They remind you of a world that existed once and can never exist again. As the years passed, I didn't move on. People like to use that phrase, but they don't understand how impossible it is. You don't move on. You just learn to carry the weight differently. Some days it feels light, almost manageable. Other days it crushes you without warning. I spent so long living in that emotional fog that I stopped expecting anything from life. The doorbell stopped ringing. The house stopped seeing guests. Holidays became days I simply endured. And slowly, I accepted that this was the life I would live. A quiet existence filled with memories of a daughter who would never walk through the door again. At least, that's what I believed until the night she actually did. It started slowly, so subtly that at first I thought it was just my mind playing its usual tricks. When you've lived with grief long enough, you get used to your own thoughts trying to ambush you. You get used to imagining footsteps that aren't there, or voices that aren't real, or flashes of movement that disappear the second you turn your head. So when the first strange thing happened, I brushed it off. I had to. Accepting anything else would have meant reopening wounds I had spent years trying to scar over. It was a small sound at first, a soft tapping coming from her room. Not loud enough to startle, not sharp enough to panic. Just a light rhythmic tap, almost like fingers brushing against the wall. I sat on the couch and listened, holding my breath as the noise came and went. As if someone were testing the space, touching it, learning its shape. I told myself it was the house settling, or maybe the wind, but houses don't mimic patterns. Wind doesn't tap in familiar rhythms. Still, denial is a comforting thing, so I clung to it like a lifeline. Then there were the missing objects. Nothing important, nothing valuable. Just little things that belonged to her. A hair clip she used to wear. A tiny bracelet made of plastic beads. A crayon from her box. The red one she always used to draw hearts. Things I knew I hadn't touched in years. Things that had their places. Untouched, like relics of a life preserved in fragile glass. They'd be moved slightly, a few inches to the left, turned at a different angle, or sometimes they'd disappear and reappear days later, in spots that made no sense. I started questioning myself, wondering if grief was finally eroding something in me that I couldn't get back. But it wasn't just the objects, it was the atmosphere. The energy in the house shifted. You don't realize how familiar the air in your home is until it suddenly feels different. The temperature would drop without warning. Not everywhere, just in her hallway or near her bedroom door. A subtle chill that felt too directed, too deliberate. I'd walk through it and feel a tightening in my chest, as if someone were standing beside me, as if I had stepped into a memory instead of a moment. And then came the humming, soft, distant, almost like it was drifting through the walls. A child's humming, the kind that rises and falls with no real tune, just the sound of innocence filling an ordinary moment. I froze the first time I heard it. My blood ran cold, and for a few seconds I genuinely couldn't move. It was so familiar. So heartbreakingly familiar. She used to hum when she colored, when she brushed her doll's hair, when she swung her legs on the edge of her bed. That little melody with no direction. Hearing it again felt like being pulled backward through time and slammed into a version of myself I wasn't ready to meet. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a neighbor's child, maybe a sound drifting from somewhere outside. But the humming was always inside the house, always faint, always fleeting, always stopping the moment I strained to hear more. It wasn't loud enough to follow, but it was close enough to be unmistakable. And something inside me, the part that wasn't governed by logic or fear, felt drawn to it. Like some buried instinct recognized something I didn't want to acknowledge. Nights grew more unsettling. I would sit alone in the living room and feel the sensation of being watched, not in an aggressive way, not in a threatening way, just a presence, small and quiet, lingering near doorways or around the corners of rooms. The way a child might peek out from behind furniture, curious but cautious, wanting to be seen but too afraid to step forward. I'd look up suddenly and catch the faintest flicker of movement, like a shadow darting out of sight. Always small, always fast, always just enough to make my breath hitch. And I started dreaming of her more vividly than I had in years. Dreams so lifelike I could almost smell the shampoo she used, almost feel the warmth of her hand wrapped around my finger. In these dreams she never spoke. She just stood there, looking up at me with wide eyes, as if waiting for me to say something first, as if waiting for permission to come closer. I'd wake up shaken, unsure whether the dream had been a comfort or a warning. The line between memory and reality blurred more each day. I'd walk past her room and swear I heard soft footsteps inside. Sometimes the door would be slightly ajar, even though I always kept it closed. Sometimes her nightlight, the one shaped like a little star, would be glowing faintly even though the bulb had burned out long ago. And sometimes, in the very late hours of the night, when the world outside was silent, I'd hear a soft giggle drift down the hallway. A sound I knew too well. Sound that belonged to a time I thought I'd never feel again. There were moments when I'd turn around so quickly, my vision blurred, convinced someone was standing behind me. The space was always empty, or at least it looked empty. The air, however, told a different story. It carried weight. It carried familiarity. It carried something that felt like her, but wasn't. As the days passed, the strange signs intensified. Lights flickered when I walked past her room. The TV would turn on by itself, always set to the cartoon channel she used to love. I'd find little handprints on dusty surfaces, small prints, too clear, too fresh. I'd hear the sound of a ball bouncing softly upstairs, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a child playing alone in the hallway. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just grief clawing its way back into places I hadn't fully healed. But ignoring it became impossible when one night, just before I drifted off to sleep, I heard a whisper. Not a voice, not a sound shaped by words, but a breath. A small exhale, right beside my bed, and it felt like someone tiny, someone familiar, was leaning close, trying to see if I was awake. That was when I realized something had been building, something had been approaching, something had been trying to come closer, step by step, sign by sign, until it felt as natural as breathing. And even though every part of me knew it shouldn't be possible, some quiet, broken part of my heart wanted it to be real. I just didn't know then that all those signs were only leading to one moment, the moment she decided she was done waiting. It happened on a night so quiet, it felt unnatural, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, until you start hearing your own heartbeat too clearly. I had been sitting alone in the living room, the lamp casting a warm glow across the walls, trying to distract myself with anything that didn't involve listening for sounds I convinced myself weren't real. But underneath everything, the flicker of the TV, the low hum of electricity, the creak of the old house settling, there was an unmistakable tension in the air, a feeling like the world was holding its breath. I remember staring at the clock for far too long, watching the seconds slip by as if they were being pulled into some invisible void. Something felt off. Not wrong exactly, but warped. As if the house wasn't quite the same shape it had been earlier in the day. As if the shadows didn't fall where they were supposed to. I kept trying to shake it off, telling myself it was just exhaustion. Just another night where grief had worn me down to the point of sensing things that weren't there. But deep inside, I could feel it, the subtle shift, the unseen weight of something gathering just beyond the edge of understanding. And then, in the middle of that heavy stillness, came the knock. Not loud, not frantic. Just a single soft tap against the front door. A tap so delicate it could have been a child's knuckle. My body froze instantly. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. It was as if every sense in me sharpened at once. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one visited anymore. And it was far too late for it to be anything ordinary. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard a thing. But the sound had reached something deep inside. Something old and fragile. Something that reacted long before my thoughts caught up. A second knock followed, gentle, patient, like whoever or whatever stood on the other side wasn't in any rush. My heart began to pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. I sat there for a long moment, staring toward the dark hallway that led to the door. The house felt suddenly colder, as if the air had been sucked forward toward that spot, like it was being drawn to the source of the sound. I stood up slowly, and even that small motion felt monumental, like I was doing something irreversible. My footsteps were almost silent as I moved through the house. Every step closer to the door made my pulse spike harder. My hands were trembling, though I tried to hide that even from myself. I didn't turn on the hallway light. Some instinct, fear or hope or something in between, told me the darkness needed to stay exactly as it was. As I reached the final few feet, I saw it, the faintest silhouette through the frosted glass window of the front door. A small shape, child-sized, standing perfectly still, my lungs locked up. The shadow didn't sway, didn't shift its weight, didn't move at all. It stood as if carved from the darkness itself. And then I heard it, Dad, a whisper. Small, breathless, so familiar it felt like being stabbed through the heart. It was her voice, not a perfect match, but close enough to rip open memories I had tried desperately to bury. That one word held every emotion a parent could ever dread feeling again. Longing, disbelief, fear, hope, and horror. I felt like my knees might give out. My hand lifted instinctively, reaching toward the doorknob even though my mind was screaming not to. The weight of years crashed over me in an instant. The nights I had begged for one more sound from her, one more sign, one more piece of proof that she still existed in some form beyond memory. And now, here it was, on the other side of my door, whispering to me like no time had passed at all. Something was wrong. There was a coldness attached to that voice, a slight distortion beneath the softness, like someone trying too hard to imitate something they didn't fully understand. A strange rhythm in the way she breathed, a faint echo that didn't belong to any living thing. I took a step closer, barely inches from the door now. My fingers hovered over the knob. The silhouette remained motionless, almost as if waiting for permission. The air felt heavy with anticipation, the way a room feels before a storm breaks. Daddy, open the door. The second whisper wasn't the way she used to speak. The cadence was off, the tone too flat, too practiced. It made my stomach twist with dread. And yet, a traitorous part of me ached to pull the door open, to see her standing there one more time, to believe that the impossible could somehow be real. I closed my eyes for a moment, I didn't pray. I didn't think. I just listened. And in that darkness I realized something terrifying. The house had gone completely silent. No creaks, no hums, no distant noises from outside. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath again, waiting for my decision. When I opened my eyes, the silhouette had moved, slightly, but enough for me to notice. Her head tilted to the side, the way children sometimes do when they're curious or confused, but the angle was just a bit too sharp, the motion just a bit too smooth. My breath hitched. Another knock came, still gentle, but with a certain insistence now, like she was growing impatient, like she expected me to obey. Please, let me in. This time, the please sounded almost rehearsed, as if someone had whispered it over and over, trying to mimic the tone of a child begging their parent. Something deep inside me snapped into clarity. I stepped back, my trembling hand pulling away from the doorknob. The silhouette stayed still for a long moment. Too long. And then, with a slow, unnatural movement, it leaned closer to the glass, as if trying to peer in. But the frosted texture hid everything except the dark outline. I stumbled backward, breath coming in sharp gasps. I must have made a sound, because the shape shifted, and then the smallest, softest giggle drifted through the door, a sound that sent ice through my veins. Not her giggle, not even close. It was higher, thinner, wrong. And just as I reached the end of the hallway, the silhouette suddenly straightened, turned, and vanished from the door, as if pulled away by unseen hands. No footsteps, no retreating shadow, just gone. The silence that followed was worse than the knocking, because for the first time in years, I realized something wasn't just haunting my memories. It was standing on my doorstep. I didn't sleep that night, not because I wasn't tired, but because sleep felt like an invitation for something to get closer. I sat on the couch with every light in the house turned off, my eyes fixed on the door as if it might start knocking again. It didn't. Hours passed in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, only tightens around you like a slow constriction. I kept replaying her voice in my head, every whisper, every offbeat inflection, every distortion that told me whatever had stood at my door was wearing her voice like a mask. And yet, beneath the wrongness, beneath the false notes, there had been something familiar enough to tear at me. Something that made me want to believe, something that made me want to open that door. The next morning, I moved through the house like a ghost. I checked the doorframe, the porch, the walkway, looking for footprints, handprints, anything that might prove what I'd heard. But there was nothing, not a single trace, no signs of someone standing there, no smudges on the frosted glass, no indent in the doormat. It was as if the night had swallowed every physical hint of what happened, leaving me with only the memory. And the memory itself felt unreal, like something too fragile to touch, but too heavy to ignore. That was only the beginning. Whatever had come to the door didn't leave. It didn't stop. It only changed its approach. And the way it began to appear afterward, that was when I knew something was deeply, dangerously wrong. The first time I saw her, really saw her, was 2 nights later. I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps, tiny footsteps. They moved slowly down the hallway, stopping right outside my bedroom door. I froze, lying perfectly still, my breathing shallow as I listened. And then the door creaked open just enough for a faint silhouette to slip in, standing in the faint glow of the moonlight from the window. My heart dropped. The shape was small, childlike, her height, her outline. I wanted to call her name, but the sound lodged in my throat like a stone. She stood there motionless, her head slightly tilted, just like the silhouette at the door. But what made every muscle in my body tense wasn't the shape. It was the way she held her hands slightly apart from her sides, fingers stiff and too straight, like she hadn't learned how to relax them, or like she was pretending to be relaxed without really understanding how humans did it. She stepped closer, slowly, each step too smooth, too measured. Children don't walk like that. They shift their weight, they sway, they bounce, but she moved like she was gliding through the air, barely touching the floor. I forced myself not to move, not to even blink, as she reached the side of my bed. She stared at me. I couldn't see her face clearly, just the outline of it, a faint suggestion of features, but I felt her gaze. It was a heavy feeling, not warm, not loving, just watchful. And then she spoke. "Daddy?" The word cracked something inside me. It was her voice, but again not quite, slightly delayed, like someone pressing play a fraction of a second too late, slightly off pitch, like a recording warped at the edges. It was a sound that stabbed into every memory I had, pulling emotions to the surface I wasn't ready to face. I asked, barely above a whisper, "Is it really you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out one hand toward my face. Not gently, stiffly, like a doll's arm being moved by an invisible puppeteer. Hovered just an inch from my cheek, trembling slightly, as if struggling to imitate something delicate. And right then, a coldness radiated from her hand, a sharp coldness, unnatural, like ice without moisture. I jerked back instinctively, and in that split second of movement, her head snapped to the side with an unnatural speed, as if startled. The tilt of her head shifted too quickly, the angle too sharp. No human child, no matter how startled, could move like that. Her voice broke the silence. "Don't be scared." But the tone was wrong. Completely wrong. Comforting words shouldn't sound hollow. They shouldn't sound like someone reading them off a script. Before I could respond, she stepped backward. The motion didn't flow. It clicked, like a stop-motion shift, as if pieces of her movement were missing. She retreated toward the hallway, eyes never leaving me, her head drifting slightly forward in a way that made her silhouette look warped. She paused at the doorway, her small frame outlined in shadow. Then she smiled. I couldn't see her teeth, but I felt the smile, felt the shift in the air, felt the malice masquerading as innocence. And in that moment, every part of me knew this wasn't my daughter. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. She vanished down the hallway, her footsteps fading, though the sound didn't quite match the rhythm of her movement. I waited until morning before daring to step out of bed. From that night on, she appeared more frequently, each visit revealing more of the unsettling truth behind whatever she was. Sometimes she would sit on the edge of the couch, legs dangling but not swinging, staring at the blank television screen as if watching memories instead of pictures. Sometimes I'd find her standing in her old room, facing the wall, her posture stiff and wrong, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. And once, I caught her at the bottom of the stairs, her head craned upward, her entire body still, except for her fingers, which twitched ever so slightly, as if adjusting themselves. She began to mimic behaviors she used to do, but they were always just a little off. She'd hum, but the tune never quite settled. She'd giggle, but the timing came half a second too late, like she was trying to match a memory instead of feeling an emotion. She'd tilt her head in ways no living child ever would. She'd blink too slowly or not at all. And as much as it terrified me, part of me felt drawn to her. Part of me wanted to pretend she was really back, that the impossible had happened and my daughter had returned home. But the fear outweighed the hope. With every encounter, the truth grew clearer. Something had come wearing her shape. Something had studied her, practiced her, learned her, but hadn't quite mastered what made her human. And each time she appeared, her imitation grew more refined, but never perfect. For days I tried to convince myself that what I was seeing wasn't real, that it was grief, exhaustion, or some cruel trick of the mind replaying the version of her I wanted back so badly. But deep down, even in those first moments when she stood in the hallway with that almost familiar silhouette, I knew this wasn't something my imagination could create. My mind could hallucinate her laugh, her footsteps, maybe even the shape of her standing in a doorway, but it couldn't recreate the cold that came with her, the unnatural stillness, the way the air thickened around her like she carried a shadow that didn't belong in this world. It couldn't recreate the intelligence behind those small, unblinking eyes, an intelligence that didn't match her age, or her voice, or her size. The truth didn't come all at once. It came in fragments, in moments that at first felt like coincidences, then impossibilities, and eventually clear signs of something trying very hard to hide itself behind a mask that didn't fit. I couldn't bring myself to acknowledge it at first, because acknowledging it meant admitting that whatever had come into my house wasn't just pretending to be her. It was studying me, learning from me, waiting. The first clue came when I followed her one night. She drifted down the hallway, her movements smoother than any child's should be, her head turning with a slow, deliberate rotation that made my stomach twist. She walked into her old room, and I stood in the doorway, watching her from behind. She didn't notice me, or maybe she didn't, simply didn't care. Her small frame stood in the center of the room, her back straight, her arms motionless at her sides. She lifted her head toward the ceiling, not in curiosity, not in confusion. She was listening for instructions coming from somewhere I couldn't see. Her fingers twitched once, twice, then curled into tiny fists. And in the dead silence of the room, I heard the faintest whisper, too faint to understand, too soft to be human, like something crawling beneath reality itself. The sound brushed across my ears and disappeared just as quickly. She turned her head toward me, and her smile was too wide, too stiff, as if it had been drawn onto her face instead of formed naturally. That smile alone told me she hadn't heard me walk in. She had known I was there the whole time. The second clue came in the form of a drawing. She used to love drawing, her little hands gripping crayons, filling pages with crooked hearts, suns with too many rays, stick figures missing fingers. But this drawing was different. I found it on the floor of her room, a piece of paper with something scrawled across it in red crayon. At first glance it looked like a child's scribble, but when I knelt down and really looked at it, the lines weren't random. They were deliberate. They formed a shape, something that looked like a door, not a house door, but something older, sharper, carved with symbols I had never seen. Beneath it were 3 small figures drawn in shaky lines, all facing the door, all smaller than the doorway itself. She watched me as I studied it, her eyes unblinking, her expression unreadable. When I asked her what the drawing meant, she tilted her head just a little too far. Almost like she was curious why I didn't already understand, she whispered, "It's where I came from." But the way she said it, the coldness, the precision, felt rehearsed, like she had practiced the words over and over until she could repeat them without emotion. And that sentence alone shattered something inside me. Because she didn't say it's where I lived or it's where I was. She said it's where I came from, like she wasn't describing a place but an origin. The third clue was the shadows. I saw it one night while she sat on the hallway floor, her back to me, humming a familiar but broken tune. The light from a nearby lamp stretched her shadow across the wall. But the shadow didn't match her movements. When she tilted her head, the shadow tilted half a second later. When she lifted her hand, the shadow hesitated before following, and once, just once, the shadow's head turned toward me while hers didn't move at all. That was the moment I knew this thing wearing her shape didn't just exist in the physical world. It extended beyond it, like its true form wasn't fully contained in the imitation it presented. And then there was the night she finally spoke in full sentences. She rarely said more than a word or two, but that night she sat on the couch, her legs perfectly still, and stared at me. Not like a child watching a parent, more like an observer studying a subject. She said, "You called for me." I shook my head, heart pounding. No, I didn't." "Yes," she said, her voice soft, controlled. "You did. You wanted me back. You wished for it. You cried for it. And something hurt you." I felt the blood drain from my face. The room felt smaller, colder. She continued, her gaze never shifting. "Something listened. Something answered. But I'm not her. And I never said I was." Her words were a knife twisting deeper with every syllable, not because of what she was saying, but because of how calmly she said it, as if this truth meant nothing to her, as if taking her form was just practical, like wearing a familiar coat. Then she leaned forward, her smile stretching in a way no human face could stretch, and she whispered, "I came because you opened a door without knowing. And once a door opens, something always walks through." That was when the full truth settled into me like cold iron. Whatever had returned to my home didn't belong to this world. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't even tied to my daughter except for the shape it borrowed. It was something else entirely. Something older. Something patient. Something drawn to grief like a moth to flame. Something that used my longing as an invitation. And now that it had come through, it had no intention of leaving. When the truth finally stood in front of me, when every lie I told myself collapsed under the weight of what she really was, I realized there's a moment every grieving parent fears more than losing their child. It's the moment you're finally forced to accept that the universe isn't giving them back. Not really, not in the way you prayed for, begged for, or imagined during the darkest nights when you would have given anything just to hear their voice again. And it was in that moment, staring at the thing that wore her face like a borrowed mask, that I understood I wasn't being offered a miracle. I was being tested. Tested by whatever force had been listening to the echoes of my suffering. Tested by whatever had followed the trail of my grief right to my door. And I knew, deep down, that the decision I made next would change everything. She stood there with her small hands hanging stiffly at her sides, her head tilted just a little too far, her eyes locked onto mine with the hunger that my daughter never had. But there was something else in those eyes too, something that almost broke me, because it wasn't just emptiness. It was familiarity. It was recognition. It was that ghost of innocence mimicking my child so perfectly that a part of me screamed to reach out and pull her into my arms. That's how it gets you. It doesn't take the form of a monster. It takes the form of the one person you'd walk through fire for, even if it's only to burn you in the end. My hand hovered over the doorknob as she whispered again, "Dad, I'm cold." That voice, God, that voice didn't just sound like her. It felt like her. It hit the same part of my chest that used to ache when she'd cry in the middle of the night. It pulled at the same strings that had been shattered when I lost her. That creature knew exactly what to say, because it had listened to my memories, my guilt, my longing. And for 1 second, I let myself imagine what it would be like if it really was her. If she somehow found her way back to me. If the impossible could become possible. But the moment I let that fantasy bloom, something inside me shriveled. As I remembered those little details, the way her smile was stretched just a bit too wide, the way her fingers were too still, the way she hadn't blinked since I opened the door, and I remembered what I had seen in the reflections around the house, in the corners of my vision, in the shadows that never quite moved right. I remembered the warnings, the signs that something unnatural had been circling me for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. So there I was, standing between two impossible choices: open the door and accept the thing that wanted to come inside, or shut it and risk angering something that didn't understand boundaries. In every horror story, people make the wrong decision because they're afraid. But I was terrified either way, terrified of what was outside, and terrified of what letting her in would mean. 'Cause if I opened that door, I wouldn't just be inviting her into my home. I'd be inviting her into my heart. I'd be surrendering to the lie that grief had carved into me like a wound that never healed. And I couldn't do that. Not again. Not after spending years trying to rebuild my life piece by fragile piece. But she didn't move. She didn't breathe. She just stared at me with those wide, glassy eyes, waiting, patiently. Knew the battle wasn't physical. It was emotional. It was psychological. It was spiritual. And all she needed was for me to want her badly enough. So I made a choice. Not out of fear, but out of love. Real love. The kind that protects even when it hurts. The kind that says no even when your entire soul screams yes. I closed my eyes, took a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, and whispered that word I never thought I'd say again: goodbye. I didn't shout it. I didn't slam the door. I just gently, painfully closed it between us, like sealing a chapter that had haunted me for far too long. The moment the latch clicked, the air shifted. The soft tapping stopped, and then silence. The kind that presses against your ears, heavy and suffocating. I waited for a scream or a claw against the wood or some violent retaliation, but none came. Instead, a slow dragging sound moved away from the door, like something walking without bending its knees. And then the whispering started again. But this time it sounded nothing like her. It was layered, distorted, filled with voices that didn't belong to any human throat. They slid across the walls, sank into the floorboards, and faded into the distance like a storm moving on to its next victim. I didn't open the door again that night. I didn't look out the windows. I didn't try to convince myself I'd made the right choice. I just sat there, shaking, holding on to the memory of the real her, reminding myself that she wouldn't have wanted me to fall for that imitation. Grief opens doors, yes, but some doors were never meant to be opened. Some knocks were never meant to be answered. And sometimes the greatest act of love is learning to let go, even when the thing calling for you sounds exactly like the person you'd give your life to save. She never came back, not physically at least. But some nights, when the wind picks up just right, I swear I can hear that same soft knock echoing through the silence, reminding me of the night I had to close the door on my own heart, never truly her. And the more I watched her attempt to be something she wasn't, the more I realized the danger in letting her stay. Because whatever she was getting better, too much better. And one night soon, I feared she'd get close enough to perfect that even I wouldn't be able to tell the difference.